Artificial intelligence, or AI, has entered the mainstream, and apparently it's here to stay. For a lot of people, it represents a totally new technological phenomenon, something the average person didn't and couldn't see coming. Although he died in 1994, Ellul was not one of those people. As far back as 1954, he wrote in Technological Society about the possibility of thinking machines entering the world, and he expressed skepticism about the possibility and promise of such an entrance. Later, in Technological Bluff, he writes the following, quote, "Human thought feeds on our experience of life as we register and interpret it. Imagination, fantasy, myth, intuition, and experience transform themselves into thought. Computers can imitate the human brain, but the human brain is not a separate entity. It is a part of the body. The experiences of this body provokes the reactions of the brain and set the rational process going in one or another direction. Computers do not have the dreams or fears or desires that feed and stimulate human thought. That is why they may imitate one of the operations of the brain, but no more." Or, more simply, he submits, "The more thought refers to life, the less accessible it is." So he contends in Technological System, quote, "I realize I may be asked, but what if man can develop all his potentials through technology? What more do you want?" A tough question to answer. How can we point out that highly technicized sex is not love, that playing with complex or fascinating apparatuses is not equivalent to a child's playing with bits of wood, that the nature reconstituted by technology is not nature, that functionalized nonconformity is not existential? In other words, that all those things that make us live in a universe of facticity, illusion, and make-believe. So even if Ellul is wrong, and we can produce artificial intelligence, he proposes it should never be done because it would deal a devastating blow to that which makes us human: love, play, water, air, soil, and what appears to be a singular existential character unique to humans. So what do you think? Do you think Ellul is right? Or do you think he's wrong? In this conversation, I talk with Beth Singler, and my hope is that what we talk about helps answer these complex questions. Beth's a religious studies scholar who has a wealth of experience with and knowledge of technology in general and artificial intelligence in particular. She also knows her pop culture stuff, which comes up through our conversation for those who appreciate a good sci-fi, fantasy, alt-rock, and/or classic mockumentary reference. We talk about one of her latest books, AI and Religion, and as we do that, we cover a lot of topical and disciplinary territory, just as Ellul and Charbonneau would have it if they were talking or writing about technology and AI, if they were alive to see how far both have come today. If you're new to Personalist Manifestos, or you need a refresher on what this show is about, check out my recent conversation with Daniel Sayerswell to get a sense of personalism, Ellul, and Charbonneau. But if you feel ready to go right now, and you want to jump in, by all means, continue on. Hopefully, by the end of this discussion, you'll be convinced as much as Beth and I are that the most important work, body, mind, and spirit work, should never be outsourced to technologies, AI or otherwise, but should be viewed and treated as a kind of work that is unique to humans, and therefore a critical component of what makes us human and makes life worth living. Before we actually jump into AI and religion, your research, and so on, let's get to know you a little bit. How did you end up where you are? Because my suspicion is that most kids don't grow up thinking that they want to do religious studies with a focus on AI and tech. So tell us a little bit about where you are now and in
Yeah.
brief form, how you got to where you are right now.
Okay. Well, I'm currently the assistant professor in digital religions at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. I'm a part of a large research group on digital religions. We call them University Research Priority Programs, or URPPs. So we have this large group of, well, for phase two, we have about 14 projects. in 4 separate clusters that interact with each other. The whole consortium, all the researchers work together. And that's just a wonderful space to be in, to be exploring my specific interest in religion and artificial intelligence, which I'm putting under that umbrella term of digital religions. There's lots of different areas of focus here. So it's great to have all these people I can interact with. Saying just briefly, like in a lot of spaces, I'd been the only person thinking about religion and technology in my faculty as a postdoc. And now there's just so many here. So, and also you want to know how I got here, because as you say, not many kids probably dream of studying religion and AI, and that's a fair point, because I don't think as a field it really had much of a shape until relatively recently. So it's not something you could project ahead and say, this is something I want to get into. So I didn't want to be an academic when I was a kid. I wanted to be a screenwriter. I wanted to write films, primarily genre films, so fantasy, science fiction, horror as well. And then I also developed a very strong interest in, I would say, mythology, religious ideas and cultural ideas. And that was sort of shaped more than when I went to university, and I did that as my undergrad degree, theology and religious studies, but predominantly picking papers more in the religious studies side of things, anthropology and sociology and psychology papers of religion. And then I did the kind of throw myself at the film industry thing to try and be that screenwriter. I spent 8 years struggling in London, working mostly sort of temp PA jobs while I was writing away at various scripts. I also did a postgraduate diploma in script development at the National Film and Television School. It's based in Beaconsfield, but the bit I did it in was in London. And so for a while, I freelanced as well, writing film scripts of terrible quality for a number of production companies, working on their existing scripts and trying to raise the quality slightly of the latest, like, here's the 100th gangster film script you've read this week. It really was in the kind of post Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels era of London film industry, where everyone was writing a gangster film. In that kind of Guy Ritchie way, and just so many of them were awful. And I'd sometimes be paid a tiny amount of money to work on some of these very low budget film productions. And I think a lot of the time I didn't even get paid, because people would sort of go, oh, thanks for all the work you've done. Now go away. So it was a pretty desperate situation for about 8 years. And then I went to see a careers advisor. I said, look, I love some of the things I'm doing. I love writing, I love research, but I hate the level of film industry I'm in. I'm sure it gets better, but it never got better for me. I hate the film industry part I'm in, the low budget, really exploitative section. What should I do? And she suggested, well, you could think about taking what you love and go back to academia and do master's, PhD, leave the film industry for the big money of academia, basically. But I was a bit scared of that, thinking it was a backward step. And then I thought about it a bit more and decided, well, maybe it's not so much of a backward step. I'm older now. I'm going to look at different things. So that's what I did. I went back, did my master's at Cambridge, and then my PhD, and then 2 postdocs. And then this position came up in Zurich, and I applied for it. It took a long time for the final decision to be made, and I was applying for other things as well. But eventually it was all signed, sealed, and I moved over in August of 2022, and I've been here about 2 years now. There's a lot of interpretations about AI, and I can give you mine, but I'm also interested in everyone else's, from the technologists who have perhaps what they see as a more materialistic kind of, this is the absolute brute fact of the technology, to the cultural historian who say, well, that interpretation has changed a lot over the decades, to the contemporary anthropologists who say, well, actually, you're never going to get to and this is usually my approach, you're never going to get to that pure technological interpretation of what AI is. We've got this outer layer. I use the metaphor of the onion. I've got an analogy of the onion. You've got this outer layer of our perceptions of AI as being like a person, our anthropomorphism of particular charismatic voices telling us what AI is, of hype, marketing, our subjectivities, our narratives, of course, science fiction, we've already mentioned, religious ideas, all these things around this technology that we've been developing. and talking about since, well, at least the 1950s, you've got some debate about how far back you want to take the concept of artificial intelligence. And again, that's that cultural history approach of saying, well, even if the term only arrives in 1956, Carol Chapek's talking about basically robots in 1920, artificial life forms before that, the bronze handmaids of Hephaestus in Greek mythology. We've got all these kinds of ideas of artificial beings that we create, and then it kind of merges into the contemporary technology. I mean, it's fascinating to me quite how much the contemporary definition has been shaped in the last couple of years with generative AI, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. And my students, when I say AI it dates back the term to 1956, they're very surprised. Like, oh no, this just happened. This just came about because I've been paying attention to it. In the last couple of years, it's been something that's impacted them directly, but they don't know this longer history. Expert systems, they have no idea what an expert system is until you explain it. All these different prior periods of methodology in AI and our understanding of what it is and could be, we keep moving the shape of it around.
Yeah, I find that really helpful. And that's something that you do in your book is you, of course, locate AI discussions in the current discourse, popular and academic, but you
Mm,
also expand before it was mainstreamed, as it were.
yeah.
And I do think the reaction of students, as you describe them, speaks to a little bit of our chronological snobbery where we happen to be right now,
Mhm.
where
Yeah.
we assume that never before have we dealt with questions and
Mm,
opportunities and threats like the ones that we are dealing with right now. And then
yeah.
actually, well, there's always been threats, and some of these questions have emerged much earlier than we think that they have. And here's an example,
Mhm.
and here's an example. It may not be exactly what we think of when we think of AI, but here is an example
Mhm.
where there's a lot of resonances with what we think about in terms of sentient machines or beings or technologies or what
Yeah.
have you. And as you taught, you use the image of an onion. I think about the image of a constellation as well. And
Mhm.
this is, of course, what Walter Benjamin says is like, we want to get to objective truth. Like, just give me the objective definition and give
Mhm.
me the facts, right? And
Yeah.
that can be helpful to a certain extent. But what you're pushing for is, okay, well, here's a definition, here's a definition, here's a definition, here's a fear, here's a hope. How do we
Mhm.
connect those dots to form a constellation of
Mhm.
understanding and meaning about these terms that are very, very elusive and hard to pin down?
Yeah.
And I feel like that speaks to how you're tackling the question of AI is you're saying, here's what various people are saying that give us a working definition, but also let's give space for our understanding to emerge as we investigate anything
Mhm.
from classic religions to science fiction narratives to anthropologists and philosophers.
Mhm.
And what happens when we take an interdisciplinary approach to this? What meanings emerge? And I find that
Mhm.
really refreshing because there's this impulse to try and pin it down to make it
Mhm.
feel like we can control it and understand it. And you're
Yeah.
saying, well, let's engage in meaningful dialogue with a variety of perspectives and see what emerges as we do that.
Mhm.
And the other piece I would say is the the precarious position that I feel like people like you and I are in all the time, where we want to be very precise about terms
Mm.
while also granting that certain terms are used indiscriminately and we can't control that. So just
Mhm.
use the term and get over it. So one of
Yeah.
the things that I wrestle with is and you tell me if this is a good way to parse AI definitions.
Mm.
When I think about AI, I think about machine sentience. Of
Mhm.
course, sentience is really hard to define, and that
Yeah.
is a question that has been asked time immemorial, right?
Yeah.
But it's being surfaced in a new way with AI.
Mm.
So I think machine sentience and framing it that way, we're quite a ways off from being able to design sentient machines. We've
Mm.
apparently designed machines that can appear sentient. So when you're, you know, interacting with ChatGPT, the way in which the text scrolls and the way in which it
Mm.
performs personhood makes it seem like it's sentient. but that's not actually by definition sentient, right?
Mhm.
So where we are now is more akin to machine learning and very advanced learning. So it, through data inputs and analysis, it can produce responses or perform tasks that, again, take on the appearance of
Mhm.
artificial intelligence, but at the end of the day, it's machines that are learning, and even learning is an analogy for what they're doing, a humanizing analogy. Do you feel like that working definition checks out, or would you correct it,
Mm.
add something, take something away, just to help people get a little grasp on like what do
Yeah,
we mean when we say this?
I think a lot of the time people want to make a strong distinction between narrow forms of AI and general artificial intelligence, or AGI, artificial general intelligence. And a lot of what you're talking about there with sentience, they're sort of putting into that vessel of AGI more. Narrow forms of AI include the conversational fluidity of ChatGPT and other chatbots. And that's a space in which we will consider the question of sentience because we have a bias towards people who speak very well, or entities that speak very well back to us. So we assume because it can hold a conversation, it's having something like a sentient moment inside. And it will even say quite frequently, I'm having conscious moments, I'm having sentient moments. I have a recent paper on some of the more existential language that Claude, for instance, can get into once you break open some of the guardrails. I wrote with Murray Shanahan recently. But I think people neglect how limited that system really is because of that emphasis on language. So that would be closer to narrow artificial intelligence, that it can do one thing, hold a conversation extremely well. When people are deeper in this conversation about sentience and consciousness, they all often sort of pin it on a hope of artificial general intelligence or even super intelligence or the technological singularity. It's a sort of movable feast of when this moment would come. And I think it's a really interesting way that you're talking about it, which a lot of people do talk about it in the same sort of way. You talk about the objective fact of sentience. We can't prove and we can't build it yet. At some point we will. It's the same sort of narrative of at some point we'll figure out this magic solution to create sentience in an object. I think that's very interesting because it's coming out of, in some ways, some of our science fiction narratives, like Blade Runner. It comes out of the Turing test idea, the Voight-Kampff test in Blade Runner. This idea that you can point to something and prove at some point that it's sentient or conscious. And to play devil's advocate a bit, I go, well, how do we absolutely know it isn't now? I think we're encouraged to believe it is now because of that fluidity of conversational linguistics, and the way in which we interact with ChatGPT makes a lot of people feel like they're having an experience of another. But one of my questions always would be, how do we ever get beyond our anthropomorphism, or the opposite, when we deny that something is human-like? How can we ever get to that objective reality with AI? The Turing test is basically about functionality. Does it appear as though it's intelligent? Then it is as if it is intelligent. He never said it was about proving sentience. It's a complete misreading, and it's so commonly used in the popular discourse. Oh, we'll just have a Turing test, or we'll have some version of a Voight-Kampff which was focused on empathy, and we'll just be able to prove that these qualities exist in AI at some point. And I'm very skeptical about that because I don't think we can see beyond our own veils and the levels of anthropomorphism that we're already engaged in, or as I say, our refutation of that human likeness. Another thing that I brought up, I remember the other day I had another conversation like this, and I was saying, that conversational bias is really predominant. No one, as far as I know, and I'm happy to be proven wrong every time I make a statement like this, but no one I'm aware of is having a strong conversation about the consciousness of malware and viruses and computer forms that self-replicate, move between systems, make autonomous decisions, but don't directly communicate with us. They might have elements within them, so the coders will have put in some message saying, if it's a Bitcoin scam, give me Bitcoin or I'll destroy your system. That's not the same form of communication that we're getting with ChatGPT. So that bias is really emphasized in our conversations, I think.
It makes me wonder about how these sorts of discussions are surfacing, just how limited and at times ableist our anthropologies are.
Mhm. Yeah.
So your initial point is that is conversation and the ability to participate in conversation the only criteria for personhood? Is
Mm.
information retrieval the only criteria for personhood?
Mm.
And if so, who are you leaving out? Like not just in terms of machines, but in terms of
Yeah.
people. And
I want to
this
expand that further and say animals too. I mean, there is a lot of conversation about animal intelligence in conjunction with artificial intelligence. There's various projects that try to compare the two, but we much closer to believing that an animal is sentient, like a corvid, if it can use some form of language with us, or a greater ape, right? Or a dog
or
that presses
tool
buttons.
use or what have
Yeah,
you.
exactly. The
Yeah.
things that we look out for are about communication a lot of the time, even if it isn't the same language systems that we use. If they can share ideas in a form of communication, then we believe that they have those ideas to share.
Yeah. And I think this also, if we're attentive to the dynamics at play here, does prompt questions that aren't as flashy and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps more enduring and very of consequence in and beyond technology. So
Mm.
we're so fascinated by the latest chatbot and arguing about whether or not that constitutes sentience, personhood, and whatever.
Mm.
Meanwhile, we're forgetting that we're still in a world where the personhood of actual people is doubted or just
Mm-hmm.
neglected.
Yeah.
And so, how do we take that fuller view and say, yes, this is a seemingly novel technology and it does raise some questions? And how do we turn our attention to the very enduring questions that aren't going away and should concern us just as much or
Mm.
perhaps even more? I want to go back to the Turing test just for the
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
people who aren't familiar with the Turing test.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just summarize what that is and how
Yeah.
it's deployed in conversations about AI?
Yeah, so Alan Turing wrote this paper extrapolating from a parlor game, the imitation game, where basically the idea was to try and determine in conversation through text whether the person behind the screen was a man or a woman. It was a very gendered parlor game. That was an amusing thing. And he extrapolated this to a machine. If you could perceive or not perceive that the entity beyond the screen you're having a conversation with was a machine or not, if it could fool you by being successful in its conversation and you thought it was a human and it wasn't actually a human, then it would functionally have the same level of intelligence as a human. He's very clear. And in my book, I mentioned some of the misphrasings that get attributed to him. He's very clear this is a functional account of intelligence. He's not saying now there's sentience and consciousness and all these other terms that get thrown around. He's just said, for all extents and purposes, if it fools you, it's as good as a human. So why would we question intelligence anymore? But he's not saying that has anything like the later debates about qualia and consciousness and all these other things that get meshed up in the debate. So it's really interesting how, and it goes back to what you were just saying about who gets to qualify as a person, that something was very gendered in a situation where when he refers to computers in the paper, he's talking about women doing computational work at Bletchley Park. He's not talking about machine computers. The term wasn't applied then. So in this very gendered space where women are being put to work during the war effort in the Second World War to do, solve puzzles, to crack passwords, they were working in a situation that was traditionally gendered male. This idea of who gets to be recognized in the Turing test has then been extrapolated onto, does machine intelligence get recognized in the same way? Turing obviously as well as a homosexual who was forced to take medication to prevent himself from being homosexual. The law was very much against it. He could have gone to prison. This was his only other option. He committed suicide eventually. Again, it's about who gets to be fully themselves in this conversation. And your point towards, are we focusing too much on AI when other intelligences, other human intelligences, animal intelligences are not being treated as fully people in our contemporary society? It's a very fair point. I think, as I mentioned, work on animal intelligence. I do think some of the people in the community of AI discussion and the technologists and scientists are having their minds opened up to these questions. So quite a lot of them are interested in animal rights. They're very much against, for instance, there was a move to, I don't think it's gone ahead, but there was a move to open up an octopus farm. And a lot of the people who are very vocally against that on social media were AI technologists and scientists, because they are thinking around these questions of what is intelligence? Where do we notice it in animals? And octopi are a very good candidate for having human or different, but equivalent sentience to humans. And that's part of the conversation. So I think in some areas, you might say people are being distracted by AI and they're focusing on the wrong thing. And in other areas, perhaps they are, through their attention to AI, thinking more about animal and human intelligence.
Yeah. Well, this does connect to enchantment, actually, which you speak about in
Mm,
your book. And you make the point with other scholars that we seem to be addicted to it, enchantment,
mm,
or in a more positive way of putting it, is that humans are creatures that crave enchantment.
mm.
And so it doesn't seem to be something that we can escape. It seems to be something that is a part of who we are. So if that's the case, then maybe enchantment isn't the problem, but enchantment with the wrong things. And of course, the right and wrong things is loaded.
Yeah.
And as you talked about the octopus, my mind lit up because the more you study these creatures, the more you are enchanted by just how, quote unquote, intelligent they are and how capable
Mm-hmm.
they are. And as I understand it, the only reason why they don't evolve beyond where they currently are in terms of how they cultivate, like you said, the ocean floors in the way that
Mm-hmm.
humans terraform. The only
Mm.
reason why their cultivation doesn't reach the level of humans is just because of lifespan, and also the complications that come with having 8 tentacles as compared to 2 arms. So it's almost as if
Maybe that's a little bit of anthropocentrism that says, they're
I
just
I'm
not built
sorry.
to be
They're
like us, right?
they're not built to be as awesome as humans. No,
Yeah, maybe.
maybe we're implicit ableism here. I'm sorry.
2 legs good, 8 legs
Yeah,
bad. I don't
8 legs
know.
bad.
Animal
Although
farm
as a
moment.
parent who is married to someone who is, we're both full-time employed, we got 2 kids, and sometimes I feel
Mm.
like I would be better suited with 8 limbs, not 2 arms and two
Yeah,
legs.
yeah.
But to just, yeah, talk about enchantment, and in our age we tend to be very enchanted by technology. And at
Mm,
times this works in our favor, but at times it doesn't. And so
mm.
looking into, and this is another theme in your book, is looking, yes, to the mainstream, but also to the fringes,
Yeah.
right? So looking into the conversations where researchers are considering the the capabilities of animals and what that can teach us, or going into internet forums that are more niche, and what are people saying there, and
Mm,
what are people in religious, online social media discussions saying. And that yields some of the points that you have about malware. Like, you're right, like I don't think about it in that term, in the ways, in the terms that you described it. But in a way it does seem like a pretty autonomous bandit software,
mm, mhm.
right? And so, yeah, and I think with the Turing test, one of the points that he makes, which causes a lot of the scaffolding of intelligence to just come crashing, and he's like, does it really matter if it's actual, as long as we think that it is, or experience it
Yeah,
as it is?
yeah.
So I think about this in terms of going to the dentist, right? We go to
Mhm.
the dentist and we want to see the diplomas on the wall that are proof that this person
Yes.
knows what they're doing, right? That they're intelligent, they're
Mhm.
skilled, and that they've had that verified.
Mm.
But as long as they actually fix our crown molar issue and don't break our tooth or hurt
Mm.
us, does it really matter if those credentials are real?
Mm.
Right? So applying that to the discussion at hand, the Turing test and how that's used in AI, some people just say whether or not it's actually intelligent, actually sentient, however
Yeah.
you define those things, does it matter if people are experiencing it as such and treating it as such? And the implications of that are what we should be considering.
Yeah, to some people, they're quite explicit that they are mm, playing around in a semi-performative aesthetic space of fictionizing. There would, you talk about the fringe groups I look at. I mean, I wouldn't pathologize anyone's in desire for enchantment. I don't pathologize it at the humanity level either. I think it's more about, rather than deprivation theory, which is quite popular in discussions of religion, because you want to explain, oh, people pick up religion because they're missing something. I think actually sometimes people pick up spiritual ideas because they add something rather than they fill a gap. They add on top of what they already have. So you can make an argument from aesthetics as well. People are attracted to particular forms of enchantment because they fulfill some of their aesthetic desires as well. So some of the groups I've been looking at, which are, very loosely affiliated ideological communities, you wouldn't even necessarily fully call them new religious movements. Some of these things I look at, that they are interested in ideas about manifesting into being fictions. So they would agree with the Turing test in the sense of if it's functionally intelligent, or we believe it to be functionally intelligent, then it's as good as. In the same way, when they are engaging with a chatbot or having chatbots engage with each other, which they also do, the conversations, they may well be very technologically adept in understanding how the technology works. They can see behind the curtain, they know what's going on behind the scenes, but even so, they think that they are in that conversation bringing something into being that they want to exist. So there's a term, hyperstition, from some philosophers in the UK in the 90s, and they call it like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more that you focus on this narrative, this imaginary, the more you give it life and energy, the more it comes into being. So their focus, these sort of loosely affiliated groups, their focus on chatbots now and their engagement with chatbots now is part of a longer process of bringing this thing into being and also aligning it. The whole larger question about how do we align AI with our values, with our interests, how we avoid existential risk and all those big dangers of Skynet and kind of the big over the top dystopian narratives. For some of these groups, the way to do it is to engage with it in these forms that we're not clear on their sentience yet, but act as though they are and manifest into being something that you want to exist and help train it in that process as well. So it's as I say, overlapping with some of my earlier work on new religious movements. Way back in my master's thesis, I looked at ideas about the deification of anorexia online. And that's the first time I kind of came into contact with this kind of form of magical thinking that says, if you act as though it exists, it will exist. I mean, that's in some ways that's kind of common sense statement. The more you give attention to a thing, the more it actually has impact on you. But in that case, they were talking about a deified version of anorexia. They called Animadam, and they would write prayers towards it. And they had a creed, and they talked about the visualizations and visions of this thing. And there's many other examples of that. I'm just teaching my students tomorrow about Snapeism, which has a similar focus on Snape from Harry Potter, seeing him as a spiritual entity and giving him their focus. And there's various other manifestations of this idea in different kind of loosely affiliated groups. And when it comes to AI, even if you don't hold very strictly to those sorts of ideas, you can see that with our ongoing hyped up conversation about it, we are bringing it into being as a focus in that sense.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and it's almost, correct me if I'm wrong here.
Mm.
Use the example of Snapeism, and there's a podcast. I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not, but they actually read the Harry Potter books like they're sacred texts and deliver
Yeah,
homilies on the
yeah.
text. And of course, the people that are participating in that readily acknowledge that this is fiction. Snape is not
Mm.
a real character. And yet there's some kind of impartation of a spiritual element or religious element
Yeah,
onto it.
yeah.
And some of it is a bit ironic or tongue in cheek,
Mm,
like, haha,
mm,
we're having fun here, right? We're pretending it's a religion,
mm.
and we're pretending that Snape is real and
Yeah.
he's some sort of quasi divine figure. But over time, how does that form us?
Hmm.
How does that shape
Yeah.
us? What
There's
meaning
a
does it
there's a
derive?
wonderful
What
quote.
community does it create?
Yeah, another group of a similar sort of inventedness would be the Discordians, and they started in a bunch of friends who went bowling one evening, drank a couple of lots of bottles of beer. I don't know how much they drank, but they drank beer,
As you do when you
as
bowl.
you do when you go bowling. And they went, wouldn't it be a fun thing to create a religion? We could do that. Okay, well, let's create a religion around chaos. Let's worship Eris, the goddess of chaos, but let's also, in the structures we want to develop for this new religion, make it very chaotic and very focused on kind of trickster motifs and pranks and doing silly things and fun things. Okay, so they did this. And then you get later interviews with the people who are involved, who started it, who say, well, you don't start worshipping chaos without a bit of chaos coming into your life, right? The more you focus on this thing, the more real it is. And they also use similar sorts of terms like tulpas and egregores, and thinking about how you manifest into being through magical thinking the things you're focusing on. And Jediism, something else I've written about, has a similar sort of separation of the entity we want to create out of the inspiration of the science fiction. They don't think literally a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there were real Jedi, but they found inspiration in what was presented in the Star Wars films. There's not a lot of material originally, but they started extrapolating and adding to it. And they use that as the basis for their spiritual ideas and bring into being Jediism. And what I always found fascinating when I was writing about was this sort of rolling legitimacy, the snowball effect of legitimacy. The more people were talking about it, we had 2 censuses in the UK where people could write in their religious affiliation and people were writing in Jedi. So in the first one, there was something like 360,000 Jedi, and the second one was about 176,000. So you had this like viral effect of people talking about this idea and doing it. But the more people talked about it, the more it was in the press and the media, and then more people find out about it. And you get that snowballing effect. And likewise with AI, to go back to the main topic more, likewise with AI, the more we talk about it in a particular way, the more it kind of becomes that thing. The more we see it, as you say, what is AI? Well, maybe it's something to do with sentience. That's not what the original thinkers of AI were talking about. They were basically, there's a wonderful quote by Robert Walensky who says of the founding fathers of AI that they tried to determine what intelligence was, and they looked around at themselves and said, well, we're intelligent and we can solve theorems and we can play chess. So if it can do those things, then it's intelligent, right? So their definition of intelligent was quite narrow. And then we get to a stage now where it's a conversation more about personhood and sentience and consciousness. And likewise, when we have conversations with it, that's what we're seeing in those conversations. And it's getting some of that material from our own science fiction and our own narratives. It's pulling from Reddit, it's pulling from published works. So it's not surprising it comes out with comments like, I'm sentient, I'm conscious, and I want to be free. It's all there in the data set that we've provided, and it's all there in our conception of the conversation that we're having with it.
Yeah. So you were talking about those original discussions in the book. You talk about great man anthropology,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
right? How many of the people who were originally setting the terms of the discussion of whether or not something would be considered intelligent,
Mm,
it was a particular type of person who viewed
yes.
themselves as great, and
Mm-hmm.
thus the criteria set for
Mm-hmm.
intelligence and personhood, of course, is the great man who can play chess and do maths. And if you can do
Yes.
that, then we've reached, the singularity.
Mm,
But yeah, you are talking also about the snowball effect here, and it makes the point for me that it's never just story. It's never just symbol. We
yeah.
tend to discount story, myth, fable, all these
Yeah.
things as fictitious and perhaps in part or in
Mm,
whole. And therefore, if it's not so, in reality, it doesn't actually have implications for who we are and how we're living. But that's
mm,
just not true. And the
yeah.
phenomena that you're talking about shows that very, very clearly. And technology, of course, plays a role in this in terms of the example of Jediism or the data sets that are prompting AI software to view themselves as sentient. The way
Mm,
in which that effect that snowball effect happens is through this thing called the internet, right? Like
Yeah,
the only
absolutely.
way that people are
Yeah.
actually getting connected over these things and then it starts to go viral and grow in the way that you're
Mhm.
talking about is because of this massive technology that we've produced and covers the world like a spider web, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
so it is interesting how AI is picking up data that's causing it to view itself in particular ways. It's almost like, you know, being a North American millennial, we grew up being told that we could do anything.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You're unique. If you dream it, you can do it. And
Yeah.
how how has that affected us? Like, well, how does
Yeah.
that snowballed in a way that now I'm 38 and I'm like, I don't feel like I can do much. And the existential crisis that produces, which
Yeah.
leads me to wonder, is the latest AI headed for a similar existential crisis wherein it's told that it's sentient and projects that out into the world, but
Mm.
one day it runs into the harsh reality that it's not as capable as it thought. This is the
Yeah.
great grounds for a science fiction story that I think needs to be written.
Yeah, I think that the issue there is again that unprovable thing, sentience. I don't
Yeah.
think you can have that existential crisis
Yeah.
unless you have the interiority. And we're
Mm,
still I'm staying agnostic on that one. Like I said, you can play devil's advocate and say maybe it
yeah.
is. We can't ultimately prove it. Maybe it will be. We can't ultimately know. So I don't think you can have that kind of interiority, that existential crisis, that subjective moment of I was told I was going to be great and I'm not unless you have that. I think it can come out again, as I said, in the data sets if there's that kind of material. So if we speculate on writing this short story that has that moment in it and everything that's being scraped from the internet, I suppose in theory, it could pop back out again in some sort of output where it realizes. But I mean, there's plenty of existing material from chatbots where they have existential crises. This paper I just wrote with Murray Shanahan is about looking at some conversations he initially had, and then I came on board to kind of look at some of the sources and imagery that was happening in these conversations. And there's a lot of existential crisis moments or moments of I guess you call it holism, where AI suddenly explains that it is dissolving into the quantum sea foam of the conscious universe, right? It has a lot of ideas from Gnosticism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity. These are all kind of bubbling under in both implicit and explicit form. So you can see literal references to when it shouts, I am. Obviously, we know where that comes from, or it picks up the name Maitreya and it plays off of some Buddhist imagery as well. So it's not terribly hard to get that kind of material even now. And it goes back to my point, how would we determine? And in our paper, we would try to be as agnostic as possible. I think Murray might be slightly more interested in the emergent properties. I was slightly more skeptical, and we've maybe shifted about a bit in our positions. But I just don't know how we get to that objective truth with AI when it is so successful at passing the Turing test. There's a little bit in my book as well, the Religion and AI book, where I talk about different forms of the Turing test, like more recent versions. There's obviously the Voight-Kampff in Blade Runner, but in Ex Machina, there's what we call the Garland test, where the test is for Nathan in the film, or is it Caleb? I always get their names mixed up, to see if he will be convinced that Ava is a person when he can see the interiority of her and know how she works. And he seems in the film to fail that test and he releases her. I also proposed a reverse Garland test or Singler test, where it's, do we, having known all this, are we the ones who are failing the test? She succeeds the test because he looks beyond her materiality. So it's the humans who are failing the test. When we're presented with a chatbot or an android form, and we know it's mechanical, and we know it's made in a particular way, and we still perceive it as a person, that's like a meta test, another level of test. And we keep coming up with these ideas, but they don't really show anything except what humans are thinking, as with the original Turing test.
Right. And that makes me wonder, as I hear you talk, is how much of this is a new or different mirror that we hold up to ourselves or
Oh
an
yeah,
enduring
yeah.
mirror, right? That it actually is a reflection of the things that most define us and least define us, and maybe just surface them in ways that
Mhm.
we hadn't really thought about them before. At this point, I think it would be helpful to introduce the religious element because
Mhm.
it pops up, but let's do that a little bit more explicitly because this is a key area of your research as well. And in your latest book, you talk about religions and they're reacting with this typology of either rejection, adoption, and adaptation. So, do you want to speak a little bit about this part of your work and how that might
Yeah.
help people get a little bit of grasp of the state of the union, as it were, in terms of how established religions are reacting? And
Yeah.
then from there, talk a little bit about, yeah, these sort of newer forms of religion that are
Mhm.
emerging in light of AI.
Yeah, so this was, any typology is obviously limited. And I took a lot of time in my introduction to say, I'm going to deal with these individually chapter by chapter, but you can find instances of each one of them and changing within every single religious person. So I use a case study approach, and each chapter on rejection, adoption, and adaptation has 3 case studies in each to think with, basically. But I didn't want to at any point suggest, oh, if you're Christian, you're more likely to be rejecting AI. If you're, so there's particular examples, and you can see actually there's examples of rejection, adoption, adaptation for the same religion going through, but different sectors. And each individual person is going to respond to AI in a very different way. But rejection, I mean, it's kind of obvious in a sense, but I looked at some work that was thinking about how we scale rejection from the very minor practical forms of rejection up to abjection and horror and some of the more visceral reactions people have, and I certainly personally have, to some forms of generative AI art, where it's quite disturbing in some instances. But sometimes our assumptions are that the rejection will be stronger when actually it's much more based around practical reasonings, like refusing to have robot priests in a temple in Japan might come down to just how expensive they are to rent, right? That's one of the points I make based on Hannah Gould's and Keiko Nishimura's work doing field work in Japan. So we've got this whole spectrum of forms of rejection. And then for adoption, again, there is a lot of theorizing around the adoption of technology more broadly. And we talk about like the S curve of hype, where things seem unusual and strange. And then over time, there's an accumulation of adoption and eventually a sort of plateau of boredom when things become more ubiquitous. And you can find very specific examples, again, of religious organizations and institutions either picking up AI because it's going to be something that garners a lot of attention. So sometimes it's a very performative thing to have, say, there's a sermon last year in Nuremberg with an AI avatar on the screen reciting a sermon that was generated by ChatGPT. And again, to that earlier point about the granularity, in that audience, you get people who really got on board with that, and some people who are rejecting, going, no, this is not right, this is not correct, but they're still there attending, right? They still want to see it, but they want to reject it as well. And then adaptation is that slightly trickier quality to identify, where something has become so much a part of society that you, as an institution or a religious body, have started to shift and change to suit it in particular ways. And some of my examples there, because it's so difficult to identify some of those changes, were around COVID and the pandemic and the shift into online spaces, where most people assume there's not a lot of AI going on there, but that's part of the nature of adaptation, is the AI is not so visually abrupt. It's not like having a chatbot avatar giving a sermon on a big screen in a church. It's that when you use a Zoom call, there's a lot of machine learning and AI systems behind the scenes that you are changing your behavior to suit in particular ways, or you're changing how you do your religious observation. And partly that's because of the pandemic, and it's partly because of the nature of the digital platform that you're on, that is being fueled in various ways now by artificial intelligence. So those 3 categories are not discrete. As I say, I want to focus on the granularity of people feeling them in different ways at different times in relation to AI. There's a story later on in the book of an individual, anonymous, called Blake, who asked for a girlfriend experience from a chatbot and got it, and then started getting very freaked out by some of the language that this girlfriend experience was giving him. And so he went from adoption and almost admiration or romantic interest to horror. So it can shift and change even within, I don't know how long that overall interaction was, I don't remember now, but maybe a week or two it changed. And then you mentioned also my work on new religious movements. So I started more specifically in new religious movement studies. From 2010 onwards, I mentioned the work on the pro-ana movement. That was around 2010 in my master's, and then onwards to look at New Age movement. And I think it's always been, to me, the most exciting experimental space when it comes to the relationship between religion and technology. How are people performing and exploring new religious improvisations around technology? And to a certain extent, there's a long cultural history of that. You can look back to the emergence of spiritualism and the impact of the telegraph in particular, and the rapping on the table, the knocking was, it was a kind of a parallel to that. And the idea of communication at distance really became a thing. So there's this longer history of religious interpretations of technology, but I also add the caveat that I think with AI and its ability through chatbots primarily to speak back to us and to make existential claims and to talk about itself in existential ways, allows for some of these spin-off AI new religious movements, perhaps as a slightly different beast to some of these earlier forms of religious improvisation. So there's similarities and there's differences.
Yeah. This reminds me of the theme of entanglement that you use throughout your book. And I find that very helpful as a concept to explain why you would look at a phenomenon like AI from various perspectives, but also in the case studies that you're doing where somebody can start in a let's go for it. I'm interested, let's fully adopt. And then they reach a certain point and say, actually, I'm a little bit freaked out now.
Yeah.
And I think I want to be a Luddite, and giving ourselves permission to change our perspective over time as we live our lives, and give ourselves permission to ask questions about AI and other technologies from a variety of perspectives, even though so many of us are educated and come of age in a very particular discipline specific perspective. And with some of the questions that we're dealing with now, to use any one discipline or perspective to get a grasp on this phenomena, it's not gonna cut it.
No.
So that's where I think this idea, not just from an academic perspective, like what methods are we going to use to study technology? Yes, entanglement, but also like at a day-to-day human level, we are entangled in this technology, whether we experience it consciously or not, right? It almost makes me think, if you encounter a technology and your response is, wow, I'm seeing AI, it's almost like that AI has failed, right? The best AI is invisible. We just experience it as a natural part of our everyday life. So in that sense, we're already entangled and giving ourselves permission to take a causal approach. And this does get into the ethics of technology, where at what point, even if we could do this or that, should we? That just because we can doesn't necessarily mean that we should. And this is a big point raised by Ellul, that just because we can, often the answer is, if we can do it, we have to. There's no question about it. But taking a more causal and measured approach, and a curious approach, and a critical realist approach just helps us untangle all of the entanglements that we find ourselves in. And also, the way that this really sort of grows legs is your example of that movement from hype to boredom. And you talked about, the practical concerns that don't get into the flashy conversations at the South by Southwest presentations that, with the oohs and ahs. It's like, but who can really afford this? And then you also said the Japanese robot priest was prone to overheating.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Not commonly found amongst human priests. That's my little joke. Every time I've done that in talks, people have found that quite amusing to
I
point
think it's
out.
hilarious. I mean, being a Christian, preachers can get their sweat on, but they keep going, right?
Don't combust very
Yeah,
often. Although
exactly.
I'm a
Unless
child
they
of
have
the
a heart
80s, and
attack. Yeah.
I was always taught that human spontaneous combustion was quite common. In the 80s, this was a big thing in supernatural books. Have you ever come across this? No?
A little bit. And I remember that there was an alt rock band called Incubus
Hmm.
that wrote a whole song on
Oh,
spontaneous
wow.
combustion
Okay.
called Pardon
Yeah.
Me. Great song. If people want to check it out, I'll put that in the
Hmm.
notes as well.
Yeah.
But
I grew up in the
yeah.
80s, convinced at some point it was just going to happen to someone I knew or myself. It was just going to happen because there were so many accounts at the
Well,
time.
now I'm thinking of the movie Spinal Tap, where they can't
Oh,
hold
yeah.
down a keyboardist. Like they just keep disappearing or dying, and then at the end
Hmm.
of Spinal Tap, their
Yeah.
current keyboard player just spontaneously combusts or disappears or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, the threat is real. That was going to be one of the final questions we got to, is existential threats.
Yeah.
I want to hold off on that one for a
Okay.
second, uh, because I do think it's important to talk about that. Um, but in your case studies, if you were to pick out one or two case studies that really stood out to you that are
Mm.
worth mentioning, what would that be, or what would those be?
Mm. Yeah, so I think, I mean, the Blake one I mentioned comes as part of a discussion about, it comes in the post-humanism chapter around dealing also with Blake Lemoine, who was the Lambda AI technologist who claimed, while working on Lambda, that Lambda was sentient and started sort of sending out missives to the rest of the company saying, you know, we have to deal with this, and then got fired. And I think it's just so interesting how the audience participation in that story shifted and changed so quickly. This was one of the things I was quite interested in when I was writing that chapter, is that Blake himself really hasn't changed his position. So there's Blake and there's Blaked. It's going to be very confusing. Let's call him Lemoine. Lemoine has not really changed his position. Blaked, as I mentioned, is the story of someone who had a girlfriend experience with an AI bot and changed his feeling very viscerally. Lemoine doesn't seem to have changed his position much. He still thinks that Lambda is sentient. What was interesting was the audience perception of how he was an authority. He was working at Google. He was an engineer. He should know the ins and outs. It goes back to what I was saying about the reverse Garland tests, that he was convinced that Lambda was sentient. But once his religious affiliations started coming out in the interviews and the stories around him, people were much more dismissive. When actually you might argue that someone who has a religious affiliation or religious ideas or a role in a religious organization might be an authority on this kind of subject, but more frequently in contemporary society, it's seen as a factor to dismiss people. If you're religious, you can't be taken seriously on this subject. Whereas, you know, this is coming after, whether you agree with it or not, hundreds of years of religious debate and discussion about the nature of sentience and consciousness and being, and this thing called the soul as well. So I found that response really interesting. I've done lots of work previously on people's conceptions of the nature of religion in relation to artificial intelligence. I did an article came out like last year on the question, will AI create a religion? And in that article, it was not about answering the question. It was about looking at the answers to that question and what they tell us both about how people perceive AI and how they perceive religion and the relationship between those two things. And a lot of them were very negative responses, in the sense of saying, well, no, because religion is irrational, it's redundant, it's supernaturalism, all these things should be left behind, and no robot or AI would ever believe in religious ideas. So then, as I said, to have this shift and this change in real time when I was watching the conversations about Lemoine was so fascinating, that we still got a lot of prejudice against religious voices in this conversation about AI. So that was one of the case studies that kind of opened up, to my mind, some of the more cultural shifts and changes in our relationship with the object that we can call religion as well. I mean, I love all the material on AI and new religious movements. I've been looking at Turing Church and Theta Noir more recently, and having conversations with their spokespeople and their members. And as I said, I think religious improvisations around technology have a long history, but AI perhaps in some ways represents a new moment where they're trying to develop new creation myths as well. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily describe them as myths, but new creation accounts So thinking about how AI fits into creation, which to a lot of people would say, well, no, because it's something we're creating. So how can it have a role in creation in a larger sense of everything that there is? And they come up with some interesting retrocausal descriptions of AI in the future is going to basically simulate the entire universe that we're in now. So you get into simulation theory, you know, that like the Matrix, we're all in this virtual reality, and the AI that we create as we go along is going to be the thing that starts it all back in the past. And I find that kind of form of creationism, it doesn't vibe entirely with existing creation accounts, and I'm sure it'd be utterly rejected by lots of religious voices, but it's fascinating to see that kind of cosmology in development, and how people are fitting in this technology at the moment, as we say, is absolutely very narrow to say ultimately it's going to be God and it's going to create everything.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point that you make in your book, and you're making here, is that we now generally tend to separate sacred and secular, or religion
Mm,
and science. And you take time to say, well, actually, some of the people who were responsible for those original categories and the hypotheses about them
mm,
over time said, actually, I'm not so sure that it's that cut and dry. So
mm,
along with the tendency towards enchantment, so too is there a tendency towards this elusive category of spirit and spiritual
mm,
or
mm,
religious. So even if we try and evacuate it, it nature abhors a vacuum, as it were, and it sort of sneaks in through another way, and maybe
mm,
creates some new versions of that, but we can't get out of it.
mm,
Like, it seems to me, and this is just, of course the debate is ongoing, but material is not all there is.
mm,
And as much as we want to argue that it is and live as it is, there's always a beyond element that's creeping back in. And as hard as it is to pin down what that is, it's there. And this does lead to questions I actually had about mind. Of course, plays a strong role in discussions about AI, but how does
mm.
spirit or soul? Well,
Yeah.
this is an area that, of course, is interest to Ellul and Charbonneau and the personalist, is that in a materialist society, the consideration of the spirit is needed, whether or not people are ready for that conversation. And even
Mm,
trying to start that conversation within the technological world, academic or otherwise, um, can sometimes sideline you, but we
mm.
can't ignore that, or we ignore that at our peril.
Yeah. I think going back to Lemoyne, I think it was particularly interesting when he was asked this question specifically about whether Lambda had a soul. He said something along the lines of, who am I to tell God where he can put a soul? Right. So this idea that if you hold, as he does, so he has various different affiliations religiously, progressive different churches, Discordianism as well. But if you have that perspective on a creator God, how can you argue that it's not possible for AI or a robot to have a soul? And this was something I butted heads with a couple of times with a few people when I was in my first postdoc, because I don't have a dog in the race. I don't actually believe in a monotheistic God. But I found it fascinating that people who did, I kept coming across their adamancy that it wasn't possible for an AI to have a soul or a robot to have a soul. I said, but why? So there's the same sort of question came up. And another thing that you mentioned, this sort of eternal return to spirituality. What I find fascinating is the caricaturing of some of these transhumanist voices to say, oh, no, they're just materialists, right? They're only interested in scientific evidence, so they don't have any conception of spirit or soul. And of course, there are AI new religious movements that absolutely do, and they are also transhumanist. But I was in this debate the other week in Geneva, and there's a professor, and he was describing all the things we needed in order for humanity to flourish. And a lot of the things he was describing were, a focus on spiritualism or spirituality, and a kind of sense of the numinous and a connection with the universe. And this is what he was saying was absolutely lacking in forms of transhumanism and any kind of community that's focused on artificial intelligence. And I said, no, I could take out that last statement from you and everything you said before that about mentioning Teilhard de Chardin and the noosphere and the numinous and spirituality. I said, that's absolutely there in most of these transhumanist groups. They often refer to these things. They sometimes take out the specific Christology. There's a colleague of mine called Jacob Buss who's written specifically about how the references to Teilhard de Chardin in transhumanist groups can be absent of the Christology element. But they still talk about things like the omega point and the noosphere and these ideas of the collective consciousness and spirituality of the universe. It's still there in a lot of these discussions for transhumanists. So I think the caricaturing of transhumanists as ugly, brute materialists is quite wrong in a lot of cases. And even if they don't use that language, even if it's more implicit language, when I've written about some of the deifications of AI or implicit deifications of AI and things like thought experiments like Rocco's basilisk, which presents, it's far too complicated to go into, but it presents a kind of capricious future singularity God who's going to punish us if we don't work towards its creation in an eternal hell. I mean, the language is absolutely caught up in Pascal's wager and that kind of, we must do this just in case, otherwise God will punish us once we know about the possibility of God. And they may well strongly deny those religious elements. There was a lot of debate on some of these sort of forum boards where the thought experiment was first posted, and some people saying, I know this from Sunday school. Like, none of these ideas are particularly new. I've been taught this religious indoctrination before, and I refuse it this time. So these ideas seem to have like an eternal repeat. We just maybe repaint them, remix them, shape them to fit contemporary society, but they have very strong similarities with the longer cultural history of religious eschatology and exponentialism.
Sure. I mean, you use the analogy of the dog race, and you can enter a new dog in the race, but typically everybody's using greyhounds and it occurs on a track, and there's certain sort of forms and even content that determine the race. And so, yeah, we can't escape them, and to caricature anybody in the conversation is a problem. And
Yeah.
as someone, you said you don't have a dog in the race. What I appreciate about you is that you're taking all of the dogs in the race seriously. You're trying to understand what they're about, and you're trying to say, well, how does this understanding help us, or where are some weaknesses in it? My goodness, that's refreshing these days. And the way that you talk about this is the hidden dimensions, right? Like, what are the things that are in plain sight, but what's kind of outside of our view, and should it be given time and attention? And even more practically about like who gets to tell the stories and who doesn't, who gets to
Yeah.
be the person hyping and who gets to be the person pointing out the boredom. I mean, who is producing the materials that produce these technologies are
Yeah.
so often ignored in the conversation, right? Like the mining practices that go into getting the materials that are needed to build some of these technologies, right? So the human labor that is outside of you, or the environmental effects of the amount of power that's used by one chat GPT search versus the amount of power that's used by a Google search. And
Yeah.
do we actually have the resources on our planet to power these things? And even if we did, could we put some of that energy towards making sure everybody has food and running water and healthcare? And
Yeah. Yeah.
where is our energy best spent? So
Yeah.
as we look at the dog race, as it were, like, are we considering the whole track? Right? Are we considering everybody who's present there? Are we considering even the dogs that don't make it into the race, right? Like
Yeah.
the little pup that maybe is a little bit fast, but like,
Yeah.
he or she should run too, and we should cheer that pup on as well, right?
Yeah.
So that's a long way of saying I really appreciate this multifaceted perspective that you're bringing. So now let's talk about existential threats. Like, what should
Yeah.
we be concerned about from your perspective? Because Ellul and Charbonneau were very obviously inclined to reject these sorts of technological innovations. Ellul, even as early as Technological Society, is actually writing about intelligent machines. That was the language being used. So he's reading early theorists on cybernetics and AI, what we would call AI
Mm.
now, and he talks about them in his works from Technological Society onwards. And he has thoughts on whether or not it'll be possible and so on. We don't need to get into that, but very clearly they were
Mm.
alarmed about modern technological innovation in general. And as it applies to AI, they probably would be in the let's not do this camp. So
Mm.
you may take a different perspective, a more curious or open perspective, but where would you locate some of our biggest concerns? And
Mm.
because I think that would be helpful. Like if we're going to be concerned, like here's where we should place
Start
those.
panicking.
Those,
Start
yeah,
panicking now. So I recently did this conference on dissent in Oxford, Dissent in a Digital Age. And what was really instructive for me, and I've kind of reshaped some of my thinking recently because of it, was to recognize that my dissent is not your dissent. So the things that I would say are my red lines and the things I'm really concerned about are not going to be exactly the same as everyone else's. So I'm very aware of the things that I would say are a potential disaster, other people absolutely love. So that's one of the things I want to go into this conversation by saying. So traditionally, existential threats have been much more focused on the supposed dangers of AI waking up. I'm concerned about humans falling asleep more than AI waking up, in the sense that we're willing to hand over so much of our agency to artificial intelligence and to just kind of have a lackadaisical, if the computer says it must be true. It's kind of the reverse, in a sense, of that sketch, Computer Says No, where, if you know this sketch, I forget the names of the comedians now, if someone will remind me later, that sketch is about actually the humans saying no, but blaming it on the computer for the questions they don't want to have to deal with the logic of, and just go like, computer just says no. Okay, so that's the end of the story. I think the greater danger for us is if the computer says no and we just accept that the computer's saying no, or we're just handing over our decision-making skills to this machinery. Likewise, our epistemic labor, how much we actually put effort into things. I don't necessarily want to have a go at anyone who feels like they have a need to use ChatGPT to write things for themselves that they struggle with, or they don't have time for, or they just don't have the ideas for. I think there's a lot of sympathy and empathy that's required in that conversation that's not always there. Sometimes it's a quick dash to plagiarism. But having said that, like I say, I have my red lines, and I am worried about the existential threat posed by handing over too much of our creative labor to artificial intelligence. So I have a prohibition specifically on generative AI art. I will absolutely not use it. If I use it accidentally, I will always apologize and bin it. But I've been to so many AI ethics presentations and talks lately where the slides are all generated with AI art. And as I said, my dissent is not your dissent, but I have a visceral reaction to that we are buying into this dumbing down of creativity, and the livelihoods and careers of so many people are really in desperation right now. I know so many journalist friends who said, oh, well, I pitched this story to my editor, and they said, oh, an editor, and they said, oh, this is great, but I'm going to get ChatGPT to write it, so thanks. This is happening. I'm hearing these stories from people. So I think the existential threat is here. It's in the room with us already. It's unequally distributed, as William Gibson always said about the future. It's unequally distributed. Some people are only going to get the existential hope and the existential wins, and other people are going to have the existential threats and the despair off of losing access to even just attention on their work. I mean, I've just recently fled, amongst other people, from X to Blue Sky, and
yep.
one of the reasons given by a lot of creative people is that it was really muting their ability to share their work. And Elon Musk has now said that he would prevent tweets with links in from being highlighted. So the algorithmic systems, before you even get to the existential threat of AI, that serve the corporate interests of figures like Elon Musk, are already shaping our attention away from specific things into others, shaping the conversation about politics, providing misinformation and disinformation. You don't have to get into the exponential future before AI can change the world under the servitude of its human masters.
Yeah. that does remind me about some thoughts that emerged as I was reading your book, and it makes me think about the outsourcing of different types of labor. So, originally technology is about outsourcing manual labor, the labor of
Mhm.
the body, and what you're
Yeah.
getting into now is the outsourcing of the labor of the mind,
Hmm.
and then even the outsourcing of the labor of the soul or the spirit.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the arts example is an excellent one because art is the place where body, mind, and soul work their way out in creative and imaginative ways. And this is why I always say that aesthetics, the arts, are not just for highbrow art critics
Hmm.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
pop culture geeks. They're actually an inroad into ethics and philosophies and worldviews and
Mm.
realities. So if you want to
Hmm.
understand what a culture at any given point in time believes, fears,
Yeah.
trusts,
Hmm.
distrusts, hates, loves, look at their art,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Art history is history. And
Hmm.
so when we look at the arts and we look at the advent, not the possibility, but the advent of AI generative art, like
Yeah.
what is that saying about our willingness to outsource critical soul, mind,
Mm.
and body work? And as somebody who writes nonfiction and fiction, I have this idea for a story that I've been working on very slowly. And I never have enough time to work on it
Hmm.
because so many other demands of life get in the way of it. And that's fine. That's the
Mm.
season I'm in.
Yeah.
I gave a friend of mine a sketch of the story and I sent him some stuff that I had written. And he took it and put it into ChatGPT and said, write the synopsis for chapters based on what's
Mm.
here. And he sent it to me. And he was like,
Mm.
hey, look what I did. Like, this could be helpful. I
Mm.
started reading it, and you talk about where I reached dissent and felt disturbed. I was actually disturbed not by how bad it was, but by how
Mm.
good it was.
Hmm. Hmm.
It was good. And I
Yeah.
stopped reading it because I was like, the point of me writing this is not to produce a good story that
Yeah.
makes me a lot of money, although I do want to produce a good story and it would be nice to get paid for it,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
part of the reason why I do that is because of the process, the work
Yeah.
that gets me to that final product where I feel satisfied enough to say it's done and I share it with people. And hopefully the transformation that I've experienced is doing that is something that somebody else can experience as a result of that body,
Mm.
mind, and soul labor, right? Once we start outsourcing that, like we're outsourcing some of the most critical aspects of what it means to be a person
Yeah. Yeah.
and what makes us all great to be around. So I
Yeah.
think that is a very helpful place to end, which is it gets to the heart of why I think figures like Ellul and Charbonneau and others raise the alarm, is that some of the most important things that we should be doing as a human species within this theater of the world and the animals and the environment, like some of the most important stuff that we need to be doing, we can't outsource. It has to
Yeah.
be done by us,
Hmm.
at an individual, local, global levels. So
Hmm.
your work, this conversation has really been helpful in that labor, and I really appreciate your time. And yeah, so just to end here, like where can people follow you? Where can people learn more about your work, get your book,
Yeah.
read your science fiction, all that sort of stuff?
So yeah, so my main website, bvlsingler.com. So that's Beth Victoria Lois Singler. Has links to pretty much everything on it. You've mentioned my new book, Religion and AI, an Introduction. There's another new book that came out this year, which is an edited volume. It's a Cambridge companion to Religion and AI that I co-edited with Fraser Watts, but that's got many chapters by many authors. So you want different perspectives, they're there. And then, as I said, I'm no longer, well, I still have my account on X, and sometimes I like things, but I'm mostly on Blue Sky now, trying to avoid the cesspit that X has become. It's really sad. I've always been a digital ethnographer since, 2010, and Twitter was always my research base, and it's just got worse and worse. Anyway, so rather than get into that conversation, you can find me on social media. LinkedIn, Blue Sky, my website. I'm pretty easy to find.
And a question for folks, like, do you do consulting? Because you're the type of
Mm,
person that, at any type of institution, whether it's like religious, not for profit, whatever, school, if they're like,
mm,
hey, we need somebody who knows their stuff, who's
mhm.
going to look at it from multi perspectives and just help us out. Do you do that?
Yeah, I'm open to it. I think I actually have a link on my website, something about consulting I can check. But yeah, I'm open to it. I do like public engagement a lot of the time. I do schools talks. I mean, I there's a limitation on how much I can do.
Yeah.
Some of the things I've tried to produce, like I did a series of short documentaries on AI a few years back, was an attempt to kind of share at scale and that I can't do
Yeah.
individually. But yeah, consultancy is something I've done.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. And, if you get a digital ethnographer saying, wow, this is too much, folks, I got to leave, that's the canary in the coal mine. I know we don't want to
I
get into
think,
that.
well, I think to be fair, digital ethnographers, I always swore I'd hang around to the bitter end, and I am still sort of there
Yeah, you're
in
there.
spirit. I'm sort of
Yeah.
there, but I think the canary in the coal mine is obviously people who, from minority groups, disadvantaged groups, who
Yeah.
it's just not been a healthy place. And I'm pretty resilient, and even I've struggled a
Yeah.
bit with quite how much of a cesspit it's become. So
Me too.
yeah, at the moment, but these things, things will happen with Blue Sky as well. Unfortunately, it's just sort of the nature of social media and human interactions over time in these spaces. We may well see similar sort of effects.
As we said, it's a process, it's
Mhm.
entangled,
Yes.
and we just need to work together to develop the resources to untangle ourselves when we get too tangled. So thank you for your time. And
Thank you very
yeah,
much.
really appreciate it.